Hello, it's time for the Security Weekly News wrap-up for the week of 14 March 2021. Can you believe that March is half over? Tinder, Schneider Electric, Chrome, Ulysses, Mirai, and more. And all the show wrap-ups a day early on the Security Weekly News wrap-up.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals.
We interrupt our program to bring you this important message.
It's the show that keeps you up to date on the latest security news twice a week. Your trusted source for accurate security information and expert analysis. It's time for Security Weekly News. As technology continues to evolve and expand, so have the attackers that put our critical systems in jeopardy. Core Impact from Core Security is a penetration testing tool that safely finds vulnerabilities using the same techniques of adversaries, with certified exploits and wizards that guide you through critical pen tests while maximizing the time of advanced testers by automating their routines. With Core Security, you can safeguard your infrastructure by limiting access, detecting threats, testing for security weaknesses, and efficiently monitoring data. Visit securityweekly.com/core security. We're proud to announce CISO Stories, a new podcast series in partnership with Cybersecurity Collaborative and Cyber Reason. CISO Stories features the candid perspectives and experiences of frontline senior security executives and dives deep into timely security topics. CISO Stories is hosted by Todd Fitzgerald, VP of Cybersecurity Strategy at Cybersecurity Collaborative, and Sam Curry, Chief Product and Security Officer at Cyber Reason. Listen weekly as they speak with extraordinary CISOs by visiting securityweekly.com/CSP.
All right. I can't wait to watch CISO Stories. I think it's a very interesting series that's coming up. I'll have to start summarizing it again. But I'm Doug White, and welcome to the Security Weekly News wrap-up. Let's do all show topics for this week. On Application Security Weekly number 143, Adrian and Mike had John Morello, the Vice President of Product at Palo Alto Networks. John was on to talk about the importance of cloud-native strategy for enterprise security and how to integrate that security with DevOps tools and workflows. And I mean, I've been being asked that so often lately about cloud security, about cloud-type, just how does the cloud impact this? How does it affect security? How does it change security? And on and on. And I think some of that's being driven by COVID and people starting to move more to the cloud because of that. So I think COVID, if nothing else, it accelerated a lot of migrations into the cloud. So check out that segment. On Enterprise Security Weekly 220, Adrian and Paul and Tyler Shields had on our good friend forever, Ron Gula, whose party I crashed at the last actual DEF CON that was there. I was like, hey, Ron, you know me, right? Yeah, Ron, sure. And he let me in, though. He's a nice guy. He's the president of Gula Tech Adventures, and Ron was on to cover the various aspects of investing, how to pitch ideas, what people are looking for, and if anybody knows, it's him. So he's definitely one of the most knowledgeable people in that space about just investing or how to get startups going and so forth. He also talked about another concept that's his is called data care, which is very, very interesting, and he also talked about his podcast. So definitely, he's always an informative guest and has a lot to say. So be sure and check that out with Ron. The second segment was news, and in the third segment, Ilya Kolachenko, the chief architect at Immuniweb, was on with Paul and Adrian to talk about how to handle exposed data and vulnerabilities, particularly how to do that before the bad guys find a way to use them, which is, obviously a big part of our job and what we're supposed to be doing anyway. So a very interesting segment there. On Business Security Weekly number 209, Paul, Jason, and Matt had George Finney, the CISO at Southern Methodist University. George was on to talk about the 9 cybersecurity habits of highly effective people, which I probably don't have any of because I always fail those tests. I always get they're like, which sexy celebrity are you? And I get like potato or something like that, and I probably don't have a lot of good I have a lot of bad habits, so yeah, I'm probably not highly effective. I don't know, maybe, you never know. In the second segment, the importance of culture in digital transformation, 4 ways to keep the cybersecurity conversation going after the crisis is passed. That is a good one right there. Let me tell you, that is one of the hardest things to do. And 8 new roles today's security team needs, and of course, they always have a whole bunch of additional stories, but there's just some highlighted ones there. Really like that one about how to keep things going when the crisis has passed, because a lot of times, at least when I have done this as a consultant or I've worked for somebody, they hire you when the crisis starts. You go in and everything gets fixed, and then it's like, but you need to keep doing this. And we used to say that when we were auditing all the time, was like, you can't just do this once and you're done. You have to keep doing it, and nobody ever liked to hear that. So it's an interesting topic to me. On Security and Compliance Weekly number 65, Jeff, Josh, Priya, and Scott. We're talking with Priya about legal matters. It's always fun when she's on because she is a lawyer. And for one of the rare times when somebody actually is an attorney talking about legal matters, they talked about U.S. Cyber Command and their conference on law and policy issues. So a lot of stuff there. Priya Shudri is sometimes host on Security and Compliance and sometimes a guest on the show. And she's from Chaudhry Law PLLC. In the second segment, Priya went on to talk about the legal implications of security and compliance. And the legal implications of security and compliance news. On Security Weekly News number 107, Jason Wood returned from his adventures to talk about cybersecurity bug hunting and how the bug hunting practice in general has inspired new confidence from the enterprise, which is kind of interesting. I was an interesting talk. I didn't even see the story that he pulled up, and I think I actually stole his story, and then he found another story that was actually more interesting than my story, and it was just kind of like, I hate you, no, I hate you more. That's what goes on when the camera's off, because we're all like a bunch of prima donnas, and Jason and I just like loathe each other in real life, and when we see each other on the street, it's just like, kind of stuff. On Paul's Security Weekly number 687 tonight. In just a few hours. In the first segment, Dan DeCloss, the founder, CEO, and president at PlexTrack, will join us to talk about customer testimonials about using PlexTrack effectively. So about actual documented cases where people are using PlexTrack in security space. And then in the second segment, we will do the security news. And the third segment, Dan DeCloss again, is the first episode of a mini series that PlexTrack is doing on purple teaming, and I think that will be very exciting to see this evening. So be sure and check all that out, and which will really be pretty soon now. So it's a little late in the day, and it's supposed to snow later too. So if you're here. We did have to do the news a day early this week so the crew could get in some much-needed R&R. They do all the work while we carouse and smoke cigars and have drinks and stuff. So we wish them you should wish them a happy day off in Discord. They don't want to hear from me. My favorite thread of the week is going to be something I never really thought talking about before because it's just such a sort of persistent thing, but I want to talk about a little bit. And that's 0 days. It's always a threat, right? So it's not like, oh, this is like something that was really current. But I decided, that I wanted to talk about this. But it seems like lately we've been getting a lot of new 0 days. And there was this time, a long time ago, when 0 days were, really simple things like embedded root passwords and such. And, back when I first got involved in this field back, in the 80s, everything was a 0 day back then, but it seems like a lot of that stuff got found. A lot of that old happy hacker stuff that, people used to use that was supposed to be so profound, kind of, people are like, really? Like, that's what they were doing? And it's like, yeah, that was what they were doing. And all that stuff got found out and fixed, and or those kind of things died off with new versions and security started getting embedded. And new development, even with just a little bit of shift to the left over the 70s and 80s, made huge inroads in removing a lot of 0 days from the software that was out there and the applications. And then, of course, the disgrace when it went from all of a sudden it was like this huge issue to be hacked. Lawsuits and so on meant organizations started thinking about it some more, but it seems we've reached kind of a new era or a level or something. Like, I don't remember fighting a boss or anything to get to this level, but somehow we got to this sort of new level, and I think I have a feeling about it. I might be wrong, but it was just sort of an interesting thought. So the first era was about engineers, and so somebody like me wrote code in a bubble. And when problems were found, the code, we got flagged and we fixed the code on the fly. So they would call up and say, hey, this quit working, fix it. It was kind of like, an old MG or something, and to keep it running, you have to fiddle with it all the time. And then the interweb came along, and we had to shift left, so we saw that happen. Even if it was a very small shift, but we saw some shift left with security to avoid all the massive compromise that was coming about, just because people could get to these systems that had no security at all, and everybody got to play in the pool. Run that forward a few years, and now I think we've kind of reached this era that was promised us a long time ago called modular code. So the original promise of the object-oriented theorists and academics back in like the 80s and the 90s were telling us that modular reusable code would vastly simplify our lives. And I completely, well, I got in trouble because I said object code was really just regular structured code. It was just written differently, but nobody liked that paper. But for programmers, I think we have gotten there. That modular code, the ability to reuse code, has suddenly become a real thing, and there's enough code in the world that, somebody coded a button, somebody coded a screen, and all that stuff's been done. So the idea today of just jumping on GitHub and finding a solution to a programming problem instead of smoking 2 cartons of unfiltered cigarettes is pretty appealing, although I really did like those unfiltered cigarettes, but, we don't do that anymore. So instead now, what we have is code that's made up of code that is made up of code in a kind of fractal universe of code. And that's not any different than the old code, but the difference starts when instead of it being a function and this function is called by that function and that function over here, but I wrote all the functions. Suddenly we have code that's made up of APIs, plugins, you name it, something's in there. And that means that it's become really, really difficult to actually evaluate all that code and changes, as it happens. And you don't have a person who is essentially the subject matter expert on any given application because, it was pieced together out of little chunks. And I've seen code like that even back in the old days where over 20 years people cobbled different things onto this code. And when somebody actually sat down and tried to go through all the code, which I had to do a couple of times as a systems analyst, it was really challenging, and the code styles were different and so on. So just being able to look at all that code and make sense of it all, we're going to have to start figuring out a way to do that over the next couple of years because it's going to become infinitely dynamic. And but just having patches being made in the background while your production code keeps running and you don't even know that happens starts to have that kind of Skynet feel to it, like there's something out there and it may be controlling everything. And, we actually may just, all of us now, maybe just on the front porch of AI written code. And I mean, literally think about that. I mean, there's going to come a day when there's code being written by AI that we may not even be able to actually understand as humans. I mean, somebody might, Geoff Thayer or somebody probably can understand. I mean, I'm going to be looking at it going, I have no idea what the AI is doing. So I think this modularization of code is creating a situation where it's going to be very difficult within a few years for any one person or even a team to understand all the pieces and how they work together, much less understand if there's esoteric exploits awaiting the unwary, hiding out in the API set somewhere out there on the interweb. So, an injection of malware comes into the supply chain after the fact, an update that gets installed, affects everyone down the stream. Never happen, right? Oh, yeah, right. Can you say SolarWinds? Of course you can. So I think we're going to need to refocus on development of tools and insight that's going to allow us to establish defense in depth against our own code if we're going to ever, come to terms with this. I mean, a lot of organizations can't even put together a patching plan that works and probably can't even begin to evaluate the entire stream of code that is constantly shifting. How many versions of Chrome have come out this year already? I mean, a bunch, right? And so in the end, I think we're going to need to figure out ways to protect our code from 0 days, but not just 0 days that we coded, 0 days that are all over the place in terms of lambdas, in terms of APIs, in terms of all these other components that are getting pulled out of Git repositories or wherever, because it's going to get really, really tough to defend against these things. And I think this supply chain stuff's just going to keep happening until we figure out a way to do that. And that means there's a lot more pressure to shift even further left to ensure that all these pieces are getting inspected somehow before they're implemented, and there's going to be more pressure to validate all the way to the source of plugins, lambdas, and so forth before you push them into production space. So the days of just letting the customer beta test everything is maybe going to be coming to an end. I mean, that got started it was a great way to test your product, but I do think that we may be getting close to the place where that's going to have to stop, because we're just not going to say we can just throw this out there and hope it flies. And then the news. Chinese APTs have been running a campaign called Operation DianXun, which means telco, if you didn't know in Mandarin. DianXun means telco or telecommunications, and it is apparently targeting the telco industry. Imagine that. The attacks, which are based on tactics used in the past, and it all seems to be attributable to two APTs, one called Red Delta and one called Mustang Panda. They're both Chinese APTs who were targeting last year. One of them was targeting the Catholic Church and Vatican-related institutions and other people. So there is an established sort of behavior for these two APTs. But the current target this time, as the name implies, have been 5G telco companies. And the attack started with, wait for it, phishing attack, like all good attacks start with. But basically the way this attack proceeded was then a .NET payload was executed with Flash-based malware, which was used as a framework downloader, and then that's used to download Cobalt Strike, why not, onto the victim's machine. The goal primarily in this attack seems to be espionage or possibly precursors to supply chain attacks on 5G manufacturers. Some people believe it was a response to Huawei getting a lot of criticism around the world. That's not established. Mirai botnet is back. And it's now targeting D-Link, Netgear, and Sonicwall devices that are unpatched. And it also apparently, according to the analyst, may be targeting other IoT devices inside these networks. The report indicates that the attacks were first detected in February of this year, but Mirai itself is very old. It's been around since like 2016. But it basically has proved to be a resilient resource, like a lot of these kind of old botnets and ransomwares and things that are getting repurposed into these framework type attacks. But Mirai was very effective. It's been used in some famous attacks like the Ukrainian power supply and all these kind of things. And it has evolved now over the course of its life. This current attack takes advantage of both new and old flaws in all these various networking devices. And all of them have patches, understand. I mean, we've heard this now over and over again from me. I know I've been saying it a lot, but for the last I've been doing the news now. It seems like I'm all the time talking about, oh yeah, this is a horrible attack, but there were patches available. The article has all the CVEs if you're wanting to check the CVEs out for your own vulnerabilities. But basically the attack uses the vulnerabilities to initially do a remote code execution of script. Mirai, once it has used the exploit, so this is sort of the first step phase, it uses one of the exploits for these devices, and then it allows this to be installed on the device. Then it uses wget to download shell script. So now it's just starting to sound like Emotet or anything else, but it downloads shell script from the botnet. So unlike some malware which goes to a command and control server, botnets tend to download from other components of the network. And then it downloads tools. So, for instance, one of the tools it downloads first is lolol.sh, which is a tool that has folder deletion, exfiltration. It blocks a whole bunch of ports to try to keep you from connecting to your own device. So it blocks SSH and HTTP, which means it's hard for you to log in remotely. You're going to have to take your baby, well, it's not a Cisco thing, so you don't take your baby blue Cisco cable, but you'll have to take whatever kind of cable you use to connect to these devices. And then it pushes a scheduled job in that reruns lolol.sh every hour. So it just kind of, so if you see lolol.sh in your cron list or whatever, you know that you have been infected with this type of Mirai. It also downloads install.sh, which installs Golang. It installs a brute forcing tool called inbrute and a file called combo.txt, which has got a set of credentials that inbrute can use for credential stuffing attack on the system. Finally, it downloads dark.arch, which is the Mirai botnet propagation tool. So, patch stuff. Come on. This story basically reaffirms what we all know. SMS text messages are not secure. Imagine that. For some reason, that old superstition of security through obscurity always comes back to haunt us. It's kind of like the strongly held belief that a signature somehow is some kind of magic spell and one ring to bind them. Kind of thing. because I see that all the time where they force you to sign things like legal documents and whatever, and somehow that's supposed to be, some kind of proof. Yeah, right. I mean, I guess a signature can be, but they have to have a record of it on file, and then you have to have an expert on handwriting to analyze it, and your handwriting has to be consistent. I got in all kinds of trouble with this with the government. But anyway, in this story, Joseph Cox of Vice.com worked with Lucky225, who's a security researcher that we've seen named here before, and they were trying to show how easy it was to capture text messages from Cox's phone. They used a tool called Sakari, which is one of many. But Sakari basically focuses on mass marketing, and it's designed to help you collect information and text and tweets and all these kind of things together. And they used this tool to sign up for the service. And he said it only cost $16. And when Lucky225 signed up for the service and paid, there's a free version too, but Lucky paid $16 and put in Cox's phone number, guess what? He was able to see everything. He literally was able to see what was going on there. Now, granted, he did have to sign a letter of authorization that said he would not use it inappropriately. I love those. We used to have this thing where students had to sign this ethics pledge, and the company selling the ethics pledge, all the logos and everything, charged quite a bit of money for setting it up, and they put all these plaques on the walls and all this kind of stuff. And I said, won't unethical people be more likely to sign the ethics pledge than ethical people? And the company kind of got a bit bristly about that. They didn't like that at all. But it was very tempting for me to steal all their laptops and stuff while they were busy congratulating everybody, on getting all these people to sign the ethics pledge. I thought that might be kind of amusing, especially since I had just signed it. I was like, then I'll steal all your stuff and say, yeah, but, I signed an ethics pledge, so it couldn't have been me. But anyway, probably works about as well as those promise rings and things work. Anyway, our friend Allison Nixon from Unit 221B also commented on this article, and she said that she worked with Lucky225, and her phone had the exact same effect. So basically the only thing preventing this type of attack was that you're signing an agreement that you won't use it for bad things. The article itself is very comprehensive about all this and how it can be exploited. I really found it enlightening. SMS is often perceived as a very secure thing by some people for some mysterious reason that I don't really understand. A vulnerability in Blink, the browser engine in Chrome, marking the third 0 day in 3 months found in Chrome. This was another use after free 0 day, that basically a memory pointer allocation error. Essentially, when you allocate memory in an application, and then you create a pointer to it, or it may be created automatically depending on what language you're using and how sophisticated it is. The location is then used, and when you're done with it, if you're a good coder and you signed your good coder ethics clause, you basically would, of course, deallocate that memory. And of course, if you're a really good coder, you would also delete the pointer to that memory. But people often don't do this, or they assume that it gets done. And this is where use after free errors usually start. Somebody fails to do that, the pointer persists, and then somebody figures out the pointer is there. And once they know where that pointer is, they can use it to push code into that memory location where it may well be executed with the same level of privilege as the original application is running, which is probably like root, right? Because, that's how you run everything. Updates for Chrome are in the process of rolling out. Obviously, we've all become more aware of the need for this, but I really wanted again to mention to you the need to plan for your users on both on-site and at home. Because if you're not restricting images for people from home and they're connecting with who knows what, they may or may not be patching this stuff or even know what that means. So I do worry about some of these deep freeze operations a lot, because it does take time to push out new images and it's disruptive and so forth. So you really need to think about how to get patches pushed out quickly and safely, and to ensure that people do actually do that. It's easy to say, and it's hard. It's easy for me to sit here and say it, and it's really hard to do in real life. Claroty found vulnerabilities in Schneider Electric Smart Meters called PowerLogic Ion/PM meters. The meters use a proprietary communications protocol called Ion, which runs on port TCP 7700, and Claroty found that malformed packets could allow for a logic flaw, and at least that's what it sounded like to me. Basically, the logic flaw meant that when you were testing the inbound buffers and you found a malformed buffer in there, basically what it would do is it sort of like it had an OR in it, and on one side it would generate an error, but it also went ahead and pushed that out onto the stack. which, of course, is now a sort of buffer overflow kind of problem. And this had the impact, and there were two different vulnerabilities related to this, but one of them allowed remote code execution. So they were actually able to do sort of a traditional, buffer overrun kind of thing. And in the others, it was just a denial of service. So that one was a lower score. But the first one had a score of 9.8. So that's a pretty serious issue. It was remediated with version 3.0.0 back in July of 2020. But of course, as ever, as I keep saying, you do have to do these updates. And these are theoretically OT networks, which if you're using the Purdue model and you're like doing it correctly, it should be pretty isolated, and you have 7700 TCP blocked anyway from the outside. But you may want to review just how porous your firewall has become over time, because that does tend to happen. And if you don't audit and you don't review, over time it starts to leak. A defense contractor called Ulysses Group specializes in intel support to governments, now claims it can access over 15 billion vehicle locations worldwide each month. The data is historically and even real-time available, and they claim that they are making it available for use, I'm sure for pay, by U.S. agencies. According to Motherboard and Gizmodo, the document claims that Ulysses can geolocate cars in nearly any country except Cuba and North Korea. Obviously, if you have a car manufactured recently, like in the last 5 years, it probably has at least some subsystems that use cellular or even Wi-Fi to phone home and upload data. And the value of automotive data is now estimated to have a $450 to $750 billion a year value. So you can bet that everybody who manufactures automobiles and other vehicles is working really hard to collect this data, because it sounds pretty valuable. According to the report, various agencies like the DHS and the FBI have all been spending a lot of money and time on this data. It's not exactly clear where the data comes from, since there are maps, geolocations, and other things that are involved in this and the collection of this data. But Privacy for Cars site, who is a privacy advocate about, for cars, as the name implies, says that the data is very convoluted and it may well contain a lot of errors. But the estimate is that by 2025, most vehicles will be generating location and other data pretty much continuously. So either go out and buy an old MG with Lucas Electronics, or get ready to be monitored, whether you like it or not. And finally, Tinder is partnering with Garbo now, a nonprofit organization that provides background checks to add background check information to the dating site. It's expected that Match.com, who owns Tinder, will expand this into they have a whole bunch of dating sites like OkCupid and other stuff like that. And as you might guess, users are often concerned about their dates on these kind of sites. 60% of women under 35 who were polled about this said they were pestered or sent inappropriate pictures after using the site. Not sure how this works or if it will work, but it may be the beginning of things like Garbo being used on a wide variety of websites. I would imagine Uber drivers and riders would really like to see if the person driving that Uber that's coming to pick you up was like, I don't know, a serial killer or something, if assuming that's in their background check. Now, based on my experience with background check, it's pretty clunky, and it takes a while. I mean, Garbo supposedly sped this up, but it's old-fashioned. They don't share data across state lines or jurisdictions, so even if you had a warrant out on you in Rhode Island, they may not actually have a record of that warrant in the background check system in Massachusetts, and in fact, I will tell you they probably don't. So maybe Garbo fixed this somehow. Or maybe it's a self-report kind of thing. I don't know. But the ones we use are pretty limited, and it's still not going to pick up somebody who has no criminal record who, is just like, my first crime. Anyway, and that's a news wrap-up for the week of 14 March 2021 in the time of plague. Be sure and stick around for Security Weekly later, and if you can, get vaccinated. I'll see you next time. Bye.